Hey, day drinkers. Happy Thursday night, Friday morning, if you're listening to this on the podcast. It's been a great week. What a reading week it's been. On Tuesday, we discussed The Magnolia Palace by Fiona Davis. That was amazing. It's up on the podcast right now. I encourage you to go check that out, particularly if you're a writer. She had some really cool stuff to say about pacing and cliffhangers. And tonight's guest, I don't know how she managed to pull this off. There's gonna be a lot of things to talk about, and I actually have a paperback copy, so I can give away one copy. I won't sign it. I won't forge her signature, but one copy if you make a comment. So please ask a question, make a comment. I'm going to read the back cover copy. Mom, you would like this one. I'll give you, well, no, I'm gonna give away this copy. I'm not giving you my copy, Mom. Okay, so it's called The Last Rose of Shanghai. In Japanese-occupied Shanghai, two people from different cultures are drawn together by fate and the freedom of music. 1940, Aya, I'm Aya Xiao is a young heiress and the owner of a formerly popular and glamorous Shanghai nightclub. Ernest Reisman is a penniless Jewish refugee driven out of Germany, an outsider searching for shelter in a city wary of strangers. He loses nearly all hope until he crosses paths with Ai when she hires Ernest to play piano at her club. Her defiance of custom causes a sensation. His instant fame makes Ai's club once again the hottest spot in Shanghai. Soon they realize they share more than a passion for jazz, but their differences seem insurmountable, and Ai is engaged to another man. As the war escalates, Ai and Ernest find themselves torn apart, and their choices between love and survival grow more desperate. In the face of the overwhelming odds, a chain of events is set in motion that will change both their lives forever. From the electrifying jazz clubs to the impoverished streets of a city under siege, The Last Rose of Shanghai is a timeless, sweeping story of love and redemption. And for those readers out there who feel like they can't get enough of World War II fiction, I'm going to guarantee you that you have never read a book like this, a World War II book like this. It is fantastic. So I encourage you to go grab it. But let's bring in Weina. Hello.
Hello, Molly. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you? I just asked you, but I allow me to express my gratitude. I'm so happy to be here. And when you messaged me, I was thrilled. It was like, yay! I can't wait
Well,
to talk to you.
I was so compelled. I mean, again, this is a part of, World War II fiction is so popular, but this is a setting and a time and characters that I have never read in fiction before, I feel like.
Oh, that makes me so happy. I did it first.
So I do have a million questions. Let's start with the characters and how you created these two lovers. Ernest is a Jewish refugee who's escaping Europe. Ayi, I'm so sorry. Say
You
her name.
got it,
Did
Molly.
I?
Yes,
I was
that's
talking about how, when you read in your head and you've pronounced a name the wrong the whole time.
it.
What was your inspiration for her? She is 20 years old and she
Mhm.
runs a nightclub on her own, defying all kinds of expectations. Tell us about how you created her and is she based on somebody?
Well, her name was based on the first female entrepreneur in China, and her name was Ai Sheng. So I decided to honor her by using her name Ai. I'm so sorry it caused so much difficulty for people to pronounce, but I had no choice.
No, it's exactly right. It's exactly right. It's our Western heads. Don't apologize for that.
Okay, so she was the first female entrepreneur and she owned a nightclub. And that was the most thing I knew about her. So I decided to write a character about her, but not completely based on her. So her profession was like nightclub owner, and she came from a very prominent family in Shanghai, and that's it. But in the first female entrepreneur in China, she never had an affair with a foreigner. Let's be clear about that.
Well, I mean, she has quite a life too. But was the inspiration the original woman was she in 1940 as well? Was that
Yes, yes, and she owned she the nightclub was also historical. She owned the nightclub 100 Joy's nightclub.
I
So
mean, if I ever own a nightclub, 100 Joys is, I mean, that's a top shelf name right there.
yeah, that's a Chinese name. It's very pretty. It's called Bai Le Men, but she also translated it to English, so Paramount. So in English is Paramount. In Chinese, it's Bai Le Men, and she owned it. She basically the most description about the nightclub was truthful because at that time it was kind of going downhill. But
Mm.
when she bought it, it was spectacular. It was the most luxurious nightclub in Shanghai in 1920s. And for me, I thought it was just incredible in 1920s, 1930s for a woman to be a nightclub owner. Wow, yeah. I mean, even in the US, women were not allowed to be a business owner then. So I thought it was incredible.
And you positioned her as a woman, so with like the contrasted her. So she has a sister-in-law who's having, I think she's having like her fourth child and her feet,
Sixth child.
her sixth child. She's having her sixth child, her feet are bound. I mean, she does not have much of a life outside of the home and planning. And then her husband has a lover who's a English journalist. And so she lives right between these two forces. And I wonder, how was she fun to write? Was it difficult to write? Was there a lot of information about what was available to women at that time that you could research?
It was. But first, let me tell you, Molly, you read the book. Oh my God, I'm so happy.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, I wanted to read the book.
Yeah, it makes me so happy you read my book because I love your works too.
Oh, well, thank
So
you.
it's like, so to answer your question, yes, in 1920s, 1930s, China, especially Shanghai, was kind of a blend of modern world, but also the traditional society. So many prominent women were still having this tradition of bound feet. So they were confined to the homes, but that was supposed to be a privilege. Can you believe
Mm.
that? But it was like that. But for Ai's family, especially her brother, Sengmei, Shao Sengmei, was also a historical figure, and he was raised in this prominent family, but he went to Cambridge to be educated, so he was fluent in English. He was a very successful poet. Then when he went back to Shanghai because of his family's background, he was able to own several magazines and other uh, uh,
Printing
literary
presses.
magazines too. Yes, it's very impressive because Shanghai was very modern in 1930s, but the Japanese War, Japanese Sino War, basically destroyed it. World War
Yeah.
II destroyed it. So Ai was raised by her mother, and you know her mother was also having bound feet, right? She was but she was a very strong woman figure. And even though she had about feet, she was able to go ski in Switzerland.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing. So you have this character on one side, and one thing that I did love in the book. I mean, it gets serious and scary very quickly. I mean, like on the second page, it gets real, but you also imbibe this. There's a lot of glamour, right? There's a lot of that, like nightclub, the dancers, right? Like the big problem at the beginning of the book is she doesn't have any booze and she's got to go to a rival. I mean, it really satisfies that kind of, or not satisfies. It really creates a picture. Did you have setting inspiration? Like, were you able to get a hold of pictures and things like that? Because it was so clear.
Yeah, for me, I like to write with images in my head. So when I write about the building, the ballroom.
Mhm.
I could see those people in front of me as I walks by the circular ballroom, and she could hear the music jazz around, and she could see all the people dance on the dance floor. But as an owner, she would have her own problems, and she would assess her business first, because she was very sharp and shrewd,
Mhm.
and especially at that time her business was going downhill, and all her life actually hinges on her business. She sold her jewelry so she could have a
Yeah.
business, could make a living herself. So I usually, when I write, I hear things in my head, and I would project the character's feeling as she processed this image, and then I tied these feelings into the plot.
Oh,
It,
wow, that's interesting. It must have been, I mean, on the other side of your heroine is Ernest, the refugee from Europe,
yeah,
who is a jazz piano player. So, I mean, that must have been like that must have been a lot of fun for you to write if you're seeing this sort of cinematically with, soundtrack.
I did, and I loved it. I love jazz and I love piano. That's why I made Ernest as a pianist. But uh, I'm not a pianist myself. I'm not a musician. So a lot of ideas I got when I project myself as a pianist come from my son, who you met
Your
earlier.
IT department?
My department, yes. So he took the piano lesson when he was 5, and he continued it for 5 years. So every time when he had the piano lesson, I would take him to the studio, and for 45 minutes I sat there, listen to the piano teacher, and listen to him play. So I think, though, with pianists, you somehow understand they have this kind of mindset when they play, when they perform. They are in it, they're
Mhm.
in the music, and all the emotions are in there too. So I think this is kind of similar to a writer, don't you think? More
Yeah,
you?
I do. I think that's a really good analogy, and I could feel that in this. And it's interesting, the creation of Ernest as a character. So, I mean, he's traveling with his sister, and he's left his parents behind, left horrors behind. Obviously, not. I mean, he does not know the extent, but also coming here to Shanghai and not having any opportunities, he also kind of reconnects with this part of himself that he had thought he would have to give up. As a Jewish man, he could not play music in where he was in Europe, but
Yeah,
here he could, and you
yeah,
give him this like lifeboat of purpose. And I
yeah.
wondered, you create this. Was he modeled on somebody? Was he?
No, he was. His name was taken from the author who wrote the memoir called Shanghai Refuge. And I read the memoir like 10 times. And I bought 5 copies of them, but I just kept losing them. So I kept buying them. So I really love that, because that helps me understand how those German refugees will process this situation. So I took his name. The author's name was Ernest Hepner, and he died a few years ago.
Oh,
But to
wow.
honor him, I use his name. But Ernest Reisman is completely my creation. And I'm telling you, Molly, you know that, right? When you start to have the figure, it's kind of hard to create and make him full. And Ernest took me at least like 2 years to finally understand.
Really?
Yes, I've never written a perspective from a man's angle before.
Well, I was going to ask you because you wrote her point of view in first person and his
Yeah.
point of view in third. And was that just because you're like, I don't like, I'm not gonna get into this guy's head. I mean, you were. I mean, you obviously were set in his emotions, but that was a choice.
Yeah, but at first it was like, okay, I'm a woman. What kind of right do I have to write as a German refugee, especially a man
Mhm.
and musician? I was intimidated by that. But then as I kept writing and I kept writing, I felt like he came to me alive. He was just real, flesh and real. All his thoughts were just like become part of my fiber. And with writing him as a third person actually was very helpful because I wanted to give some kind of distance to the readers, but I also wanted to give you a full experience of how a German refugee and pianist would go through this. So
And 19. Like he was
yeah,
young.
yeah, and I don't know if you caught this basically, Molly. He was 19, and uh, IE was 20, so IE was 1 year older than him. And this is another thing in Chinese tradition. Uh, it should not happen
Mhm.
because age difference, and a woman should usually always be younger than men. This is kind of the traditional perception. But I don't want it to do it. I wanted to make everything different.
Yeah.
Ernest is younger, and IE is older, more mature.
So in the book, you have quite a few difficult and heartbreaking relationships. And I gotta say, the one that really was the most heartbreaking for me was Ernest and Miriam, his sister.
Oh,
So he travels with his sister, and I'm sorry, was she like 13?
she came to Shanghai and she turned 13 on the ship, on the ocean liner. Yes. And then the school decided, hey, we're gonna get the girls together and give them a bat mitzvah, and which actually was inspired by my daughter's bar mitzvah because when I was writing that, my daughter became a bar mitzvah,
Oh,
and I wanted to put the tradition in there,
mhm.
but I realized in 1930s, did they have bar mitzvahs?
Did they? Well, they did.
Yeah.
You
So I had to consult my rabbi and ask him, hey, how was this tradition going? But he actually researched it for me, and he said, well, Weina, it doesn't seem possible that people would do a full-blown bar mitzvah for girls at that age, but maybe you can do it differently because Italian Jews in USA, they would conduct it differently. They would have a group of kids together and do a some kind of simple reading. And my mother-in-law told me like, yeah, no way, Weina, you cannot have bar mitzvah in 1930s in Shanghai because at my age, I never got a bar mitzvah anyway. So there was just a lot of questions because people were saying, hey, if you were a girl, you were not allowed to read the Torah and all kind of details. So I had to think about that. And yeah.
the the I mean, I think one of the things that I found so heartbreaking about it was, he is so young and they are just trying to survive. And there's a part of the book where he's starting to play the piano, he's falling in love, but his sister can't leave their apartment. So she's
Yes. Yes.
literally trapped. And by the time they're able to sort of like figure out what to do with her, he finds the school and
Mhm.
like division's already there. She's already and he it takes him a heartbreaking amount of time to realize that he can't get that back. That
Yeah.
those moments. I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking of my own 13-year-old.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, but Molly, you got it. You understood the whole process because I wanted it to put some tension between the siblings. It's impossible for a 19-year-old boy, basically was still a boy, to look after a young girl who lives in a strange world. And meanwhile, he has to make a living for himself and for both of them. It's impossible. For me, I think he had a good, Ernest meant well, but he
Mhm,
was not able to do it. You just think about it. He worked like basically 12 hours from 5 o'clock at night, comes back at 5 o'clock in the morning and
mhm,
exhausted. He has to go to sleep. But then his sister, who only speaks German, cannot speak Chinese, does not know how to communicate with people in China, and people in China basically refuse to communicate with her too because
mhm.
she's a foreigner. So, and she's 13.
Yeah,
So
and over her brother, just over him.
Yeah. Yeah, and her brother said, "Hey, you cannot go there. Cannot go to the old city because all those like it was very violent
Mm,
over there." And she saw so many things in old city, or beheading even,
yeah.
which was very common in that period. So yeah, if you were the brother, you would tell him, "Hey, don't go out either."
Right. And it would be too much, and I sympathized with him even as he was finding happiness. It would be you would have to compartmentalize and just think, well, she's safe. I can't also make her happy, because
Yeah,
what were there like the options were so limited. It was miraculous that he was able to get what he got. Although I did that dynamic was I
yeah,
wanted to shake him. But that also brings me to this question. I There is so much going on in Shanghai at this time. So you have picked a fascinating story, but what a challenge. I like so you have the Japanese occupation of Shanghai, you have British forces, American forces, you have Jewish refugees,
yes.
you have the war like getting worse. Were there times that you were just like, what?
I
Or that
did, I did. Yes,
that
it
things
was.
would overtake part like, did you get too deep into the Japanese occupation or, you know, how did it go? Tell me.
I first, but you are right though, Molly. My head was swimming. It was like this and that, and then I also have to control the plot and make sure the relationship is evolving, and make sure the threat is there, and make sure the Shanghai is falling, and make sure Americans had no idea what was going on. So yes, there was a lot, and there were British too, and they tried to protect the settlement, but they were just all on their own because the queen basically abandoned them. They had to go protect Europe, so they were on their own, and it was a lot to juggle. And there were also some kind of currency issues. I don't know if you noticed that because um
I
because
mean,
you
talk
know,
about the
right?
technical stuff, getting caught up by the technical stuff.
So it was like a fish in the morning, the price would be $10, and at night it would be $500.
But
And
it would be Chinese currency, but then then American currency, and then
yes,
yeah.
yeah, and there were three types of currencies in Shanghai at that time because the Japanese had their own currency and Chinese refused to use the Japanese currency and use their own. But the British and Americans use American dollars and the British use the pounds. So yeah, maybe there were four, but I mentioned there were three. So it all fluctuates. Nothing was exactly the way you expected. And they had to live through that. But for me, I did like at least five revisions,
Mm.
and my agent was was very odd at the end, and she's like, "Weina, you got this, you got it." And yeah, I was like, I after I finished it, Molly, I was just so exhausted. I was completely burned out, and I had
Oh,
to
I can't imagine. Can you talk a little bit about how it changed from the drafting process to the editing process? Did it get longer? Did it get shorter? Did you have to put in more romance or more war or more Jewish refugee experience? Like, how did the book change? Because I mean, I feel like writing is writing, but
Mhm.
editing is refining, and
Yeah.
this felt so refined. Like, it just felt really refined. So I'm just curious about how the difference between drafting and editing for this book.
I think the main thing was the character development. I really worked hard on that, especially IE and especially Ernest character and his relationship with his sister. I knew his relationship with his sister would be full of tension, but we also have up and down. It's not going to be like a brother and sibling love from very beginning to
Yeah.
the end, but you will see the moments they are going to falling apart, and he's going to try to prepare the relationship, and it's going to be successful, but then everything's going to fall apart again. this is kind of that kind of wave thing that I had to work in the draft. Another thing was the main thing was the character development about IE especially. So before the moon, the last rose of Shanghai, I wrote the Moon in the Palace and Empress of Bright Moon. So I worked really hard on intrigue and traps and plots. I I paid attention to character, but it was not like the same depth as I did with the last rose of Shanghai, because Ai is kind of a normal character, a normal person, right? A businesswoman, and I had to make her more intriguing.
Right.
But she's not exactly the the flawless character that, as you can tell in the romance novels either. She's she's not exactly likable at the end, at the beginning, but you can also tell she's sympathetic.
You'd have to, it's a stretch to call her, in my estimation, unlikable. I feel like she's incredibly sympathetic. And I also, one of the things that I really liked about her was that, yes, I mean, super forward thinking, super brave and bold, running this nightclub at such a young age. But
Mhm.
but all of that came at a cost to some extent, right? Like she had this relationship with this fiance that she couldn't, get out of,
Yes.
because then that would jeopardize the club. And she had this relationship with her brother that she couldn't get out of because that would jeopardize the club. And so
Yes.
all of these, she was super bold and independent, but then completely stifled by these two forces. And I believed that she wouldn't be like, away with you, like there was no way for her to do that.
Oh, I'm so glad you read that way. It is exactly what you said, because she's strong. She has her wish and she wants to make money to be independent, but there were just many traditional ties bound to her, and she was not able to do whatever she wants, like have an apartment of her own. She
Mm.
couldn't do that because in China at that time only divorced women or like prostitutes would do that, and
Mhm.
a person of her birth was not allowed to do it. And other thing with her relationship with Chan, they were like basically betrothed when they were in diapers. And when you have such a relationship with somebody who grew up together, you cannot just kick him away. You can't
Mhm.
do that, and you would not have a courage to do that either. So yes, she was very complex, but I what made me very difficult to write it at the beginning was I also wanted to inject some kind of voice of a spoiled, wealthy
Hmm.
woman. So at the beginning, you will hear her. She's like, "I'm the most beautiful girl in Shanghai." It was just being polite and stuff like that. But she was. But I had to project the voice in there and make her work in a
She
way.
does she does have that moment, like they're I mean, as you can imagine, this is an epic love story. There's missed opportunities, and so they're planning to leave, and she's like, "Well, I can't leave without my dresses. How
Yes.
could I possibly go anywhere without my dresses?" Oh, you. So you're the two books that you had mentioned, your first two books, they were a series, and I think I'd read somewhere that it took you 10 years to research and write those books.
Yes, that right. The first book, especially The Moon in the Palace, it's about Empress Wu. It's a biographical fiction about Empress Wu, who is the first and only female ruler in China, and it's set in 7th century China, which is like way back ancient China. And it was difficult to do that because the research material was very difficult to find in 7th century China, and I had to use like primary source, secondary, tertiary sources to understand how life in the palace would be in that period. And another thing, of course, it was very difficult for me to write because it was my first novel, and I had no idea how to control the plot and do the character. It took me like years
You're
to
like,
figure it
"I'd
out.
like to write a book that needs a lot of research that's very difficult to find." So how long did this book take you
This
to
book took me about 3 years. About 3 years.
and can you, in the research of this, volatile and interesting time. Can you talk about like what was the most surprising thing you found out?
Hmm. Most surprising thing. I have to think about this. There are many surprising
Mhm.
elements. Um, so when I was writing that, I wanted to tie the events in Shanghai with events in Europe.
Mhm.
And I was surprised to find out that in that time in 1940s, those warships in Shanghai were pulled out of Shanghai by the order of Churchill, so they could go to Singapore and then they could sail to Mediterranean Sea to protect the um, forces over there.
Right.
That was something I was not aware of, but there was just many surprising things. Give me a clue. What do you want to know?
I mean, I was really surprised by the English and American, or the Americans weren't there, sorry. The English were there, and that when they left, things got really dangerous. And I will
Yeah.
say the other thing that I thought was like a bit of a master class in how to start a book, like on the first page, a Chinese citizen on a bike gets hit by a car by the Japanese officer, and the Japanese
Mhm.
officer shoots the Chinese bike rider. And you're just like, well, those are the stakes. Like any, you can get shot at any time. And it just created this tension. I mean, I had no idea about any of this. It was amazing.
Yeah, in that period in 1930s, 1940s, China, after China lost the Shanghai city, Japanese were not very kind to Chinese citizens. However, though, Japanese were very polite to Westerners like British and Americans. So if you lived in the area where those Americans lived, you probably would only see the Japanese being super
Yeah.
courteous, and you would never see any like street shooting in the area. But for Chinese, I actually saw the photos
Oh,
of the
wow.
Chinese citizens getting shot on the street, and the bodies were just lying there. I saw that, and I was like, oh man, I needed to take a break.
Was
And
this was this something you were taught in school? You were born and raised in China?
that's right. Yes, I was born and raised in China, and they did talk about the brutality in China a lot. And of course, everybody knows about the rape of Nanjing.
Mm.
Um, but they did not talk about how courteous the Japanese was to the
Mhm.
Westerners. And that was something I read in the memoirs by the Jewish refugees. It was very interesting. That's why Yamazaki was two faces.
Yeah.
He was
Was
listed with that.
was the other nightclub owner, the Sassoon man, was
Yes,
he real? Was he based
he
on
is.
somebody?
Yes, he was historical, Molly. He was the wealthiest man in Asia in 1920s, and he came from the Sassoon family, which was a very prominent family, Jewish family in India first, and then in Shanghai. And there was a book about the family, and it was written by Jonathan Kaufman, the last king of Shanghai.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for some reason, like last week, the synagogue was talking about him, and then I had my book talk. So, Last
Oh, good
Rose
to
of
hear.
Shanghai. Now you got Last King, so King of Shanghai. It was very interesting. And Sassoon's life, I tried to build his life into the novel too. He did leave Shanghai just a nick of time before the Pearl Harbor broke out, and
And
that's why he was alive. He say he escaped.
did he and he was, I mean, he devoted a lot of money towards, helping the Jewish refugees.
He did. He came to Shanghai in 1920s and he built his empire in Shanghai and he owned like basically 18,000 properties in Shanghai.
Wow.
So if you go to China now, you walk down the Bund and you will see his building, the Peace Hotel. That's where the story is set. That was built by him. It was called the Sassoon House at first. And of course there were many other hotels nowadays like Jinjiang Hotel. It was also his property. But he lost all after the war
Right.
and he transferred his property, most of them to Bahamas. And he lived in the Bahamas like that. And yeah, and he married the nurse, and uh, the nurse was a Texan. I was in Dallas, and I was living in Dallas, and
Wow.
so yeah, it all came together, I guess.
So what are you, I mean, you are on a promotional circuit with this like wild, but do you have an idea are you working on something in the future? Have you got a plan for their
Um,
next book?
I do. I have and my next novel is called The Angels of Vienna, and it's I don't know. You cannot say a prequel, but it was before Shanghai. It's set in 1938 to 1940, and it's yeah, it will be published next year. And after that, I don't know what else to write.
Wow. Wow. Well, I can't wait. Angels in Vienna.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to read it. I can't wait for it. Weina, this was such an exciting book, a really interesting book. I really do appreciate you coming and chatting with me.
Oh, thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Getting all your writer secrets.
Oh, thank you. Talk to you, Molly. I'm sorry it's only 30 minutes, but I can talk to you for hours about the book.
Well, someday when we all get out of our houses, maybe.
Yes, yes, yes. And thank you
Thank
so much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for coming. Everybody out there, please stay safe, have a drink, read a book, get vaccinated. Thanks, guys.
Bye.